大家非常早就来出席我们的这个今天的生态人权讲座。那在我们这边讲座开始之前啊，那请我们自然生态关怀者协会啊，对不起，你的名字很长，对，生态关怀者协会的陈诗美秘书长来为我们说几句话，谢谢，请大家给他掌声，谢谢。
各位朋友早安啊！那个选择这个场地是我们觉得很精彩可是对一些参加的人来讲有一点辛苦那我们还是陆续会有朋友进来。那非常欢迎大家来参加这次 Klaus 来台湾2场研讨会，礼拜四办过1场，然后今天第2场。那我是前年第一次参加这个全球生态完整性组织，认得他因为他是里面重要的成员。然后去年第2次去的时候，他是keynote speaker。今年的会议在意大利，他又是主题的讲员所以我们觉得他关心的那个议题，台湾现在非常需要所以我们就排除万难请他来，因为他还在教书，所以他不能够来很长。而且有在周间所以很多人就说为什么排在周间？我说没办法，因为他是以后我们还会邀请他来。那我们希望有关那个全球治理这样的议题，尤其是从比较广的角度来看生态完整性这个议题，在台湾可以被当成新的重要的论述那我不占用太多时间今天在他讲完之后，还有2位教授会做回应。那因为我们只有早上的时间，所以我们当中没有休息，我们就一路继续下去。最后会有问答的时间。那问答的时间因为根据一般研讨会的经验，很多人在提问都会借题发挥，然后长篇大论所以我们问答的时间，我们会请各位要先书面写好，我们传给你要问的3位老师，这样子就今天大概的流程这样。那现在是要给那我们这一次办这个活动有很多协办的单位，各位在资料上可以看到，我们就不重复了。那今天他讲的讲题我们有这个完整的翻译那是我就是在3、4天前接到他稿子草草的翻译，然后林卓丽小姐昨天半夜一直赶到今天凌晨帮我修改好然后我们6点多去列印去那个给各位，还是热的东西。那等一下还会有陈玉萍小姐做简单的口译不过各位手上有一份完整的讲稿应该会比较好。再一次谢谢大家来参加，那我们就把时间交给我们的讲师 Klaus your turn 谢谢。
Good morning. It's a great pleasure and honor being here. Can I have some feedback? How many of you understand English language? Yeah. So I thought most of you actually would be able to follow me, but luckily we have you being here who will be translating my paper. Let me start by saying a few words about this very special place. I want to first of all honor the victims of the time of the martial rule in this country, a very dark part of the history of this wonderful country. And of course I want to celebrate that it's all over. 1987 has been a very important year for Taiwan, and ever since we are enjoying here as much as in other countries. I come from Germany and live in New Zealand, as we are enjoying 2 things, and there are 2 things that we always need to hold precious, and I will talk more about it today. Number 1, democracy. Number 2, human rights. Or should I say, number 1, human rights. Number 2, democracy. They are crucially important. At the time when Taiwan became a free country, democratic country, of course, many other countries entered a new era of democracy. Eastern Europe, including Soviet Union, well, they didn't actually enter democracy, but they tried, they had an opportunity. South Africa, and of course not the least Germany with the unification. At the time, many of you will recall this, what a liberating experience it was. I was lucky enough to be in Berlin when the wall came down, deeply moved. We thought we had a new era of democracy, freedom, and sustainability, that you can finally work towards what really matters, a sustainable future in freedom and dignity for all of us. Unfortunately, as we know, it hasn't happened. Quite the contrary. While we might celebrate democracy and human rights, they are a threat yet again. They are threatened this time not because of political ideology per se in the various countries, but they are threatened by what I call free market fundamentalism. That's the ideology of economic liberalism has gone berserk and has almost undermined any hopes for sustainability and associated with it for democratic rights and the fundamental rights and democracies that we all need. I think they're a threat. This time, plainly through corporate power and by states not able to control corporate power. This is very much what I want to talk about.
大家早安。那今天早上Klaus在这个精美人权园区里面，就是这一场演讲，他觉得非常有意义，因为这是一个曾经在戒严的时候，就是关了非常多政治犯的地方。那他希望在这里再次能够就是去纪念这一群当年曾经献身或者是曾经受迫害的这些人。那也纪念说，在1987年的时候，我们成功的解除戒严。那到现在可以跟所有其他民主国家一样，在这里享受自由平等。那但是再回过头来看说，他自己也是来自就是德国，所以他知道，就是一个国家从集权然后走向民主的过程。那在80年代、70年代的时候，其实很多国家，包括南非，还有更多的世界上的其他的角落，都有很多国家经历这样子的政治的变化。那但是，然后所以那个时候是一个充满希望的时候，包括苏联垮台，所以整个世界正在就是期待我们可以真正走向一个民主，然后就是每一个人都可以享有平等的人权的时候。但是很遗憾的，到现在我们看到就是这样子的期望并没有真的实现。那其实如果来检视的话，最重要的一个就是在现在我们看到的是一个，并不是在威权底下造成，而是因为这个自由市场出了很大的问题。那过去让我们觉得享有平等而且可以自由竞争的这样子的机制，其实现在已经深深的钳制住整个世界的运转。那让这个世界没有办法朝向有序的方向持续的成长，持续的能够让大家快乐的生活。那所以他今天的演讲会就是在不断的在聚焦在这个上面。那我们其实每个人想要追求的都是一样的，就是民主，然后还有人权。那所以我们想要透过这样子的一个演讲来一起讨论这个问题。
If you look at these two images, I want to talk about the gap between the political map here and the reality of the earth. The world of nation states has borders. The earth is borderless. The world is plentiful, but the earth is one. Our beautiful planet has to cope with two realities. One is created by humans, the other is created by nature. The problem is, of course, that nature is much older than the human species. So we ought to listen to her and learn from her, but we don't. So far, humans have by and large assumed that they can do it all alone. We have created cultural and political institutions that are not really interested in nature, only in what she has to offer for human livelihoods and economies. This is why our laws only ever speak of natural resources, not nature or Mother Earth. How can we change this? How can we be smarter and protect the very living conditions that humanity, in fact, all species on Earth depend on.
我们可以看一下这张图。那这张图的右边是一个地球图，那左边是一个人类世界创造出来的世界版图。那这两个是理想跟实际的状况的差距。那国家的组成是有边界，但是地球是一个就是没有疆界的唯一。那这个世界非常的多样，但是我们看到的这样子的蓝色的星球的现实是，它被人分割成非常多破碎的东西。那我们人自以为聪明的，在很短的时间内去创造了我们的文化体、我们的政治体、我们的社会的生活的方式，但是我们并没有去想到说这样子的我们的想法，我们并没有对大自然本身做出任何的，就是我们没有对他们投以任何的兴趣，然后我们甚至不想称这个地方为地球之母或什么，我们只称它为自然资源。所以在这里面就是我们的法律也没有任何的保护跟规范。所以我们要如何去改变这样子的情况？要怎么样能够真正变得更聪明，可以跟这样子的大地真正的契合，不是在一再的限制在这样子的版图里面，就是可以除了保护我们自己人以外，也保护所有其他的在这地球上生的有生物跟无生物。
The answer to this question has occupied many people around the world, philosophers, environmental thinkers, religions, local initiatives, global movements, in short, whoever cares for the future of people and the planet. Perhaps this includes even all of us, and no matter what we work, whether big corporations or governments or what have you, or how much we consume. Say the rich, who consume as if there were no tomorrow, and the poor, who struggle to even have a tomorrow. It would probably take a sick and pitiful personality to not care at all about the future. Yet, within our lifetime, we are seeing global ecological systems, the atmosphere, polar regions, oceans, biological diversity collapsing. The Earth simply cannot sustain us all any longer. Quite obviously, our institutions of governance are failing us. As if there were no tomorrow, states are occupied with the present, with themselves, and only insofar as their national economies are affected. States have so far not been able to grasp the global and long-term dimensions of their policies and laws. Our current policies and laws seem to have no solid fundament, just vague ideas about protecting the environment here and there.
所以呢，这个刚刚想到这个问题，其实困扰非常多有事实。那包括哲学家、环境思想家、宗教界的人士、地方性的环境运动者，那我们大家都在探讨，而且在尝试在行动。那所有的人都想要找到的这个答案呢，大概是就是我们不想要再看到富人可以无穷尽的去挥霍他们所得到的、他们所聚敛的财产，那我们也不想再看到穷人有穷人必须要去担忧下一餐在哪里。那也不想再让这个世界被企业或是政府这样子的把持。所以就是我们也都觉得有良心的人应该都会同样的希望这个世界可以持续下去，不会只有存在于今天或现在这个时代。那只有很卑鄙的人才会不会为明天着想的这样持续的挥霍。所以我们虽然一边在见证了这个自然体系可能会崩解的情况，但是我们仍然持续在抱持着希望。但是我们目前面对的状况是，这个政府不是我们的政府，是世界上的这样子的，大家各个民主国家都一样，这个政府机构已经让大家彻底的知道说，就是用政府的力量是没有办法去让这个地球能够持续的在人类的这样子活动之下，能够平衡的这样子永续的成长。那因为我们的每一个政府都只是在顾自己的国家经济的现状、它的现况、它的利益。所以我们需要，我们需要面对这样的情况，是我们现在所有的经济跟法律的制度是没有办法去保护环境，去做到积极的解决。
What I want to propose is the protection of the Earth's ecological integrity as a fundamental norm in law and governance. ecological integrity as a fundamental norm. Think of human rights, think of democracy that we are perceiving increasingly to be fundamental norms to guide law and governance. In a similar way, we can say, perhaps with even more urgency, because it's more reflective of the actual reality that we are in, that there needs to be a fundamental norm of ecological integrity in law and governance. If recognized by states, the dynamics of global governments would completely change, as they would accept a role as guardians or trustees over the global commons. At present, states behave more like corporate organizations with an unstoppable appetite for growth and everything that can be consumed. So expecting states to act as guardians of the planet is truly paradigmatic, not easy feat, and a bit like asking the fox to look after the chicken. But unlike foxes, states are not wild animals, but cultural arrangements. They are creatures of human intelligence to allow governance for people, and in a democracy, by and for the people. By and of the people, I should say. Democratic states are meant to act on our behalf to maximize the common good. In a very rudimentary sense, we can say that the state gains its legitimacy from functioning as a trustee to the benefit of its citizens. Essentially, state policies are acts of trusteeship, a model that's in the German language known as Treuhandschaft. To perceive a government as a trustee of citizens is a description in many theoretical concepts about what a state is. A bit like parents being trustees or guardians for their children. So a trusteeship in this context to preserve and enhance the common goods, whether natural, social or cultural. So it should not be too difficult to describe the role of governments as trustees of the natural commons, whether local, national or global, given the undeniable fact that human survival depends on the integrity of ecological systems. We must develop a sense of stewardship or trusteeship with respect to the global commons, the oceans, the atmosphere, biodiversity and so on.
所以他在这里要提议的是，就是保护地球生态的多样性，这是对不起，地球生态的完整性是一个就是就像人权或是像民主一样，应该是就是一个非常基本的一个国家在资本这个我们人类要再继续活动的一个基本的准则。那这个观念啊，虽然看起来会改变目前现况，但是其实它比较像是一个概念的反转。那回到现在目前的情况，就是刚刚的比喻就是国家现在的运作啊，有点像是叫一群狐狸来管鸡舍。那因为这些就是国家利益的国家的实际上的运作者，他们其实是各有私心，那他们想要瓜分的是利益，所以是没有办法照着就是本来每一个邦国在成型的时候，那一些就是理想性的就是哲学主义或者是思想家，他们刚开始在构思要城邦的这种组成的时候，那种就是监护者或托管者的这种概念。那要怎么样去回归到这样子的原初那种应该要有的概念，就是应该要再回到就是讨论出我们怎么样去托管这个环境，把这样子的概念放进去。那虽然它感觉起来好像在这个现行的这个制度下不太可能，但其实在概念上来说，它应该是要可以的，因为它是跟本来在本来的那一些理想、那一些政治的理想是非常契合的。
We as civil society have to initiate such stewardship attitudes and practices, bottom up. And we have seen, I have personally seen wonderful examples of this in the last few days with these wonderful groups that Nancy has introduced me to. This is, of course, fundamental, that we learn to live in a sustainable manner with practical bottom-up experiences in order to eventually cause our governments and states to respond and together create a bottom-up and top-bottom process of institutional change. Basically, my favorite notion, I'm using it often, what we need is a constitutional moment. A number of things come together and we can make a constitutional shift. Let me begin with an example of how the idea of respecting ecological boundaries has in fact triggered great public interest and political support and almost led to a fundamental constitutional change. I'm talking about Germany, West Germany during the 1980s.
要怎么样去改变这样的环境？就是可以看，就是其实要属于一个从下而上一个草根性的运动。那我们其实，在昨天的实地访查，也在宜兰看到非常多很精彩的例子。就很感谢子梅老师带我们一起去参观，也一起去体验。那要怎么样在实务在理念上整体去一起达到呢？这是一个宪法的重整跟改造。那这样子的例子，其实在世界上其他国家已经开始在展现了。那他现在想要用西德的他自己的亲身可以就是他第一人的经验可以跟大家分享。
In the 1980s in West Germany, we had a vivid political debate about the ecological blindness of law and governance. This led to a very promising constitutional review by the government on the appropriateness of human rights and state obligations with respect to ecological realities. At the core of this constitutional review was the question whether ecological realities require a redefinition of human rights and a special obligation of the state to protect the environment for its own sake as well as for future generations. The activists behind this debate were all environmental lawyers, or eco-lawyers as we call ourselves, Öko-Juristen. Our strategy involved the establishment of an independent Institute for Environmental Law in 1987, then a nationwide association of called Verein für Umweltrecht, an organization with 3,000 members of ecological jurists, and then the production of literature, writing about things, and organizing conferences, crucially with buy-in of politicians, political parties, and state governments. Overall, our aim was for a constitutional moment that redefined the relationship between humans and nature.
在1980年代的时候，就是这张照片可以看到一些当时发生的事情。在西德，他们有非常强烈的一系列的一些政治上面的、法律上面的一些争辩，在探讨目前那时候他们当前所遇到的那种法律治理跟当下环境运动遇到抵触的那种现象，那这使得他们创造出一系列非常有前瞻性的一些宣言、一些文思，还有各式各样的集会，甚至他们在1987年的时候创立了一个新的组织。那这个组织是背后有几千位就是这一些在环境运动里面顶尖的法律人，包括就是法官啊、律师啊、各式各样的，他们称自己为就是生态律师。就是环境，就我们在这里为是环境律师这样，那非常关心所有这一些，而且促进这一些整个从宪法最根源的法律的根源去探讨说他们需要做哪一些改变，所以他们给他一个名称叫宪法改造时刻，在这上面有翻译。那他们想要去重新去定义，因为在过去的宪法里面并没有定义这样子自然它的角色跟它赋予的它自己独有的价值，还有它在人身上的意义。所以他们希望能够重新去建立这样子的东西。
An example includes the Robbenklage, or a lawsuit on behalf of the seals of the North Sea. There was a widespread killing and dying of seals during the 1980s caused by chemical toxic substances that came through the German rivers, the Rhine River, mainly, eventually reaching the North Sea, killing North Seas in their thousands. So we took one sample of a seal to the court in Hamburg, representing the plight of the natural environment, arguing that the environmental laws of the Federal Republic of Germany have a very, very narrow and far too narrow approach by purely protecting the health of human beings, rather than protecting the natural environment, including seals. Of course, we lost the case. The German Spiegel magazine titled, how absurd, how ridiculous. Of course, tongue-in-cheek. It was legally nonsense, but morally sound, and has led to a number of changes in the laws with respect to animal welfare, with respect also to the natural environment. Just as an example how an action in a very specific case can, if the time is right, trigger certain things.
这个要举的例子就是这个法案，那它是德文，所以我就不再多做翻译。它在1988年的时候发生，就是他们一群环境律师、生态律师，他们他们提出了一个案子，而且是真正在法庭上面去辩论、去辩护。那这是关于他们的德国北海岸啊，本来有很多的海豹，那这些海豹因为北海岸是河川出海口，所以在那边就是所有河川的那个废弃物随着上游整个这个工业农业的那个废水这样下去以后，就是突然发生那段时间内有很多海豹就是每年大量的死亡或是生病。那所以他们在打官司的时候，就是说就是在抗议说这一些海豹是因为我们人类的环境的，就是在这个活动里面造成的环境影响，然后死亡，所以应该要有人对他负责。但是其实那时候的法令当然没有任何相关的东西，所以就是甚至有就是记者在他们的标题上面就写说怎么会这么奇怪，就是这整件事情非常的奇怪，没有人可以就是参透。那当然这个案子最后输掉了，但是它是一个在法律上完全站不住脚，但是它在道德上完全能够就是得到大家的共鸣的一个案子。所以呢，就是虽然它输掉了，但是它激起非常多的讨论，也让政府重新就是开始有很多人重视，有很多人从不同的地方去质疑、去讨论，然后后来带起了一系列各种各样的就是宪法到那个政策上的改革。
Our proposal for constitutional reform was to respect ecological boundaries by redefining human rights and redefining the role of the state. Essentially, the use of natural resources would no longer, the use of natural resources would no longer be protected, but only the sustainable use of natural resources. That means that the onus, the burden of proof, would be on the person or the company to demonstrate that their proposed activities would not negatively affect the integrity of relevant ecosystems. Remarkably, our proposals were supported by the Social Democratic Party, back then in opposition, but one of the two major political parties, as well as by both major churches, the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church, questioning the traditional human-centered or anthropocentric worldview. And this is then, questioning the anthropocentric worldview, and this led to a major review of the Constitution, ending with a final report that concluded, after 3 years of work, the question of either an anthropocentric or ecocentric approach to the Constitution is of such fundamental importance that the Commission did not see itself as mandated to answer it. Instead, the Commission calls for a wide expert in public dialogue before considering such a change.
所以他们这样子一系列的运动，以及他们对宪法改造的提议，就是刚刚在这边有解释，就是在想要重新去定义这个国家跟就是在 国家里面的人，然后或者是整个世界上的人，在这个环境里面可以运作的范围跟它的疆界。那所以不再是像以前那样，我们可以自然的去运用，比如说我是一个国家体，我可以运用我国家内的自然资源，而是你应该要能够永续性的利用国家资源。那带出来的反射就是，我们不再能够随便的申请，我想要运用国家答应就可以，而是我要申请的同时，我要提出我的证据，为什么我的申请可以确定是永续的，那需要去站得住脚，而且是要让可以去共同检验的。那当然这并不是那么容易，但是他们这样子的一个，就是他们这样的一个提案是有就是明文的提案呢，却得到就虽然看起来好像会受到很多阻碍，却得到了非常多，包括德国当时主要2个党。还有德国主要2个那个基督教团体的强烈的支持，那他们也发出声明去支持他们。那在那个委员会就是在他们在 review 这样子的一个那个提案的时候啊，最后他们提出来的就是最后报告，最后同审报告就提出说，关于这个提议，他们也认为就是这个过程非常的重要，但是还有充满争议。他们这个委员会本身，他们不认为他们的这一段时间内的检视就可以足够到去回复这样子的一个问题，所以他们希望可以在任何改变之前，再有更多人一起参与这样的讨论。所以这是一个开放性的结束，就是得到一个很好的结果。
As you know, in 1989, the wall came down and German unification took place. And the new government lost interest. In fact, it concluded later on to say there is no real need for prioritizing the ecology. The economy is equally important, just as a footnote. So we get a taste that economic neoliberalism kicked in at this stage. Nevertheless, thanks to pressures from society, we had constitutional changes, quite significant ones. The state also in its responsibility for future generations protects the natural foundations of life. It is meant to be a non-anthropocentric obligation. 1994, 2002, a specific inclusion of animals. Like in Germany, we had a number in other German-speaking countries, significant constitutional changes. In Switzerland, 1992, and Austria, 1994.
当然大家也知道，在1989年末的时候，柏林围墙倒塌了。那东西德合并的这个过程，就是有很多就是政治上的冲击啊什么的。那他们在那一年，就是刚提到这个委员会做出的这个结论就被暂时搁置。那甚至就是最后，其实过了一阵子以后，德国的那个政府其实是提出说是那事情是没有办法处理这样。但是其实就是可以看到，因为还是有非常多的政治人物跟社运团体不断的在提出各种施压，所以其实有很多一系列就是慢慢的开始有很多法令是逐渐的在里面就放进了这样子的中心思想。那这样子的思潮也让其他的德语系国家，也就是成功的带动世界上其他国家也持续跟进，然后大家投入这样子的绿色的改变。
As a very quick remark, many of you will know about the so-called energy turnaround, the Energiewende that's currently happening in Germany, the phasing out of nuclear power, the phasing out of coal power has been announced just a few weeks ago, still sort of worked through. These changes, of course, they need to be seen in the context of an organized environmental movement, always in the context of legal reform, constitutional reform. So many of my mates and friends who have been promoting the Energiewende, the energy turn, they're the very same who promoted the constitutional change. Now these are significant commitments, phasing out of these disastrous technologies, but then more specifically reducing greenhouse gases emissions up to 95% by 2050 and increasing renewable energies to 60% by 2050. That's the current commitment that Germany has made.
所以就是同时也提到说，这样子的思潮同样带动另外一个很重要的运动。那这个是很近期的，叫做已经被就是在德国被叫做能源转向的运动，它是从2011年开始的。那他们有一系列的一些就是他们的承诺，就是这是在德国里面。 他们希望可以做到的这一些，就是包括逐步的关掉核能电厂，然后逐步的推行其他绿色发电，然后还有降低温室气体的排放量，而且是都到一个非常显著的程度。这些不管是到2020年或到2050年，其实都是一个长程的一个就是他们的使命这样。
Like Germany, we have the greening of constitutions all around the world. As you can see here, some 60 national constitutions are being recognizing a human right to a decent environment. Other 60 constitutions recognize individual responsibility as part of our human rights to protect the environment. And some 100 constitutions recognize an obligation of the state to protect the environment. I realize the Taiwanese constitution is a bit outdated here. It doesn't do it.
那这里其实看到从1990年到现在啊，其实很多国家也都在他们的宪法里面逐渐的把他们关于对自然的承诺放进去，那就是会讲到就是他们就是人对于自然的承诺跟责任这样。那有越来越多的国家的宪法其实逐步的在转变他们自己的对世界的观点。那当然他知道就是台湾的宪法有一点点旧，所以可能还没有到这部分。
So, I have so far talked about constitutions of nations, for example Germany. Now looking at the international level, where we see similar developments. We do not have a global constitution, of course, but a conglomerate of treaties, principles, institutions of international law, and the United Nations system. This conglomerate has some ingredients of what can be called constitutional arrangements. For example, peace and universally recognized human rights are fundamental principles of international law. And together with environmental soft and hard law agreements, could be perceived as what some call a thin global constitution. As I want to show now, ecological integrity could be seen as a truly constitutional principle or Grundnorm of international law and governance.
刚刚谈到的这一些啊，就是都同样也适用在国际的层次，但我们并没有全球的宪法，可是我们有很多其他条约可以去达到这些，包括联合国这样子的一个庞大的组织。那所以比如说像这种人权啊，或者是那个自由，或者是民主的这一些准则，其实都有在协议或是其他的方式里面被纳入，就是让美国国家都有那种就是有柔性施压的效果。那所以就有点像是他称为就是西国的全球宪法这样。那他们希望可以把这个生态完整性的这种概念放进一个就是国际观里面，就是他刚刚用德文讲的，就是一个准则的一个世界观。
No less than 23 international environmental agreements refer to ecological integrity as a specific requirement. The first example of this kind was the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, adopted in 1980, which recognized in its preamble the importance of, quote, protecting the integrity of the ecosystem of the seas and surrounding Antarctica. Another example is the preamble of the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which calls for, quote, working towards international agreements which respect the interests of all and protect the integrity of the global environmental and developmental system. Then in Principle 7 of the Rio Declaration from 1992, it specifically says states shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of Earth's ecosystem. This has been repeated in other documents in Johannesburg 2002, recently in 2012 at the Rio+20 summit. So there is a kind of general understanding among states that the preservation of Earth's ecological systems is an overarching objective. And if you apply the usual standards of the recognition of concepts in international law, we can say that the repeated and consistent references to ecological integrity amount to an emerging fundamental goal or Grundnorm of international environmental law.
所以在刚刚提到很多这一些世界上环境相关的法，不管是就是里约国际的合约啊，或者是就是1980年代有一个最重要的一个南极海洋生物保育条约，这一些还有在各式各样的其他国际宣言或国际运动里面，我们都可以看到生态完整性这个词被放进里面，或者是类似的词。那这个完整性的概念虽然是在这么晚近才提出来，却获得很多的共鸣，因为它可以很快速的包容，而且让很多人都能够了解这个所谓的完整性、健全性的这样子的概念是怎么样子，就是应该要被我们纳入。当我们在讨论人跟环境的关系的时候，作为一个基本的一个需要受到大家重视的一个议题。
The challenge is, of course, to make states actually following their own promise, which they don't. And this addresses the more fundamental issues of governance. Are states actually equipped to deliver? The shortcomings of the current state-dominated system are well known, but not easily overcome. The idea of creating new institutions for safeguarding the global commons aims for a middle ground. States are still assumed to play a pivotal role, but shared with members of global civil society, representing the interests of the global commons more credibly than state delegates.
所以就是这样来看，说生态完整性其实是非常重要，但是要怎么样把它放进我们目前的架构里面，其实当然仍然是一件非常困难的事情。所以就是接下来在讲到这个重建治理的前面的时候，我们要去谈的就是关于这个部分。
In any case, there are two preconditions under which it is only perceivable for states to make those changes. Number one, recognizing the severity of the threats that humanity is facing is an important first precondition for more effective governance. While we can assume that most politicians, political leaders are concerned about at least some global threats, they continue to isolate them from each other and from their underlying causes. Instead, they focus on issues that can be managed pragmatically and within the dominant paradigm of economic growth, with environmental protection at its periphery. In other words, states and their representatives continue to ignore the severity of the problem. The first step, therefore, is a hold to pragmatism, accept the systemic nature of global threats, and start to think about solutions from there. This will in itself install a sense of urgency that actions under the current system of international law and governance appear to be missing.
所以在达到这样的情况，我们有两个先决条件。那接下来会谈到第一个先决条件，就是要认清这一些威胁的严重性跟急迫性。那这是建立全球治理非常重要的先决条件。虽然我们知道有很多国际领袖，包括像高尔这样子的，就是领导性的领袖，他们会去提出关心，甚至是倡议这样子的全球性的威胁，但是他们仍然持续的是用就是在实际作为上，仍然是孤立的一件事情去讨论、去看这些问题。所以这样切割就会造成就是这一些环境问题，因为他们是互相相关，是永远不会被改变。所以换句话说，就是我们必须要先终止这种国家实用主义的这一种就是现行体制的这种危机。那去正视说这是具有急迫性的，一定要被改变。
An equally important second precondition is to realize and act upon the inherent limitations of the system of current state governance. Historically, international law has evolved around the recognition of absolute state sovereignty. This continues to be relevant, with respect to traditional challenges of safeguarding peace and autonomy and welfare of peoples and citizens, something very important here in Taiwan to develop this kind of sovereignty. However, today's ecological, social and cultural and economic interdependencies require a more sophisticated concept of state sovereignty. States are not factually sovereign, but utterly dependent on other states to meet their common responsibilities and responsibilities for the commons. Notions such as smart sovereignty, responsible sovereignty, or erga omnes and jus cogens duties aim for defining the relationship between the national and the global in a new way. They have emerged from the experience of the last 20-30 years of dismal states' behavior, ignoring, for example, the ethical foundations of the United Nations. Putting national interests over global interests is profoundly wrong, as it overlooks the mutual dependency of states and their citizens from the well-being of the planet as a whole. While rich and powerful states tend to defend their national interests stronger than poor and less powerful states, there are no real winners. Ultimately, we are all facing the same risks and challenges. The only credible solution for a dismally falling system of international law and governance is to renew it in a way that gives full weight to global interests alongside any national interests.
第二个也是同样重要，就是要认清当今这个政治决策体系的本质上的局限性。那要怎么说呢？就是历史上我们会发展出国家主权这样子的一个概念，就是因为我们需要去国家里面的人民需要被保护，就要被在这个国家里面需要被就是自由平等的对待。但是这样子发展的结果，而且这样子的概念是非常重要，包括现在台湾正在持续在争取的是这样子的一个概念，但是这样子发展在国际之间的时候，是把整个国际的，就是整个环境、世界的利益就是把国家的利益凌驾在世界整体的利益之上，那这样会造成就是没有办法永续的形成。所以他刚刚在讲的就是我们需要在找到一个新的方式，是在认同国家内部的这个主权的同时，要同时能够正视说各国之间是相互依存的，那没有哪一个国家可以透过就是多拿到一些资源，然后最终仍然可以赢过其他国家，因为我们是必须互相合作的。所以大国虽然会有比较多资源，但是小的国家的环境的影响同样会影响整个世界的效应。
In institutional terms, the renewal can be described as a shift away from the current state-centered model of international governments to an Earth-centered model of global governance, or Earth governance, which is based on the partnership of nation-states, United Nations, and global civil society. Earth governance starts from the viewpoint of one Earth for all people. It recognizes the borderless interconnectedness of the planetary system and the right of each person and each community to benefit from their bounty and life-enabling services.
所以提出一个新的观念，就是全球治理，或是称为地球治理。那这样子的一个用语就是从当今国家我们喜欢用就是国际治理这样子的概念，就是再重新转向，然后提出一个新的方向。那这样子的一个词强化了整个国际间大家是伙伴的关系，而不是一个竞争跟敌对的关系。
This involves the recognition of three aspects. Actually 3, it's not 2, so 3. The first one, planetary boundaries. Now the planetary boundaries modeling, which occurred through a very influential article published in Science in 2009 by a team around research at the Stockholm Institute of Resilience, has been very fashionable in European governments. Planetary boundaries modeling basically is a system to show thresholds that we must not overstep as humanity, to create a safe operating space for humanity.
这样子的一个 系统牵涉到3个面向，而不是这里写2个面向。那第一个是在讲到说它是有极限不能替代，这里提出一个观念，就是叫做地球的疆界。那这个疆界的是一个新的科学理论，它有一些就是进一步的一些定义。那其简单的说，目前它是分成9个不同的面向，每个面向都跟地球能够永续活动非常相关。那这些面向都可以透过科学的方式去量测跟去推论说，在什么样的情况下，这个地球会就是失去它的永续性。所以我们可以借由这样子的一些这一些不同的概念来了解说，我们在哪一些部分已经失衡，然后要怎么样去做到进一步的那个改变。
This is the Pentagon boundaries model, by the way.
这个是图示。
A second aspect concerns the question: how do we measure this safe space, the green space inside? This is a safe operating space. We must not go beyond the safe space. Now, the concept of ecological integrity would answer the question how we actually change our behavior, our laws, in order to stay in that space. So we need to positively define what the integrity of ecological systems actually are that we are depending on. What is the maximum threshold for climate change, deterioration? And of course, we have these famous figures: 350 parts per million and 2 degrees average temperature and so forth. So for major 9 ecological systems of the planet, you can determine what the safe threshold is, and in positive terms, how to get there. How can we then reorganize the law in order to achieve this? And this is the concept of ecological integrity.
那第2个就是刚刚讲到那一个图，那我们已经知道了它有不同的面向，需要去就是在生态完整性底下，我们要考虑地球环境的不同面向我们人类对他们的影响的时候，我们要知道怎么样去测量它。那个测量会影响我们知道什么时候生态完整性会受到非常严重的或者是就是绝对性的影响。那还有怎么样去做改变？比如说像刚刚就是最严重的那个是其中之一是全球暖化的问题。那这个暖化的问题，我们当然听到很多，比如说温度上升多少的时候海平面会怎样，或者是就是到了哪一年的时候会发生什么样子的问题。但是实际上就是这些就是根据像这样子的一些推测，然后去做出来一些估计，还有就是后面的行动这样。
So for the remaining 10-15 minutes, let me talk about a current project that is trying to translate these ideas into something practical. This project that I'm going to talk about is called the Earth Governance Project, which is a collaboration between a number of groups: a Planetary Boundaries Initiative based in London, the Global Ecological Integrity Group that some of us are members of, the Stockholm Resilience Center, the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law that I'm a member of, the Earth Condominium Project, and the United Scientific Advisory Board to the Secretary General. This Scientific Advisory Board has been established in 2014, last year, and has the function actually to directly inform the Secretary General about the findings or the sort of state-of-the-art thinking of social scientists and other scientists. So that's a quite useful vehicle, perhaps, to get the message across to the United Nations. Maybe translate that?
Yeah. 所以从2014年去年开始，他们展开了这样子一个就是地球治理专案计划。那这个专案计划就是刚念了很多，在这边都有翻译，就是有很多国际性的网络已经开始就是串联合作，而且是共同投入这个活动。那这个主要的工作处建立在伦敦。那它开始了以后，其实不只是过去以来的环境运动者，还有已经投入其中的一些工作者，还有社会运动倡议人士啊，其他相关的人也投入。那希望能够透过更多力量、更多不同的想法的角度的加入，能够让这样子的倡议能够达到更宽广的角度。
A key aim of this project is to investigate some institutional rearrangements around the notion of trusteeship. Institutional reform within and around the United Nations system has been of interest for some time, and a range of proposals have been presented. For example, there is a long-standing discussion over the possibility of a World Environment Organization or a Global Environmental Organization. As early as an early proponent of this idea of a World Environmental Organization was Renato Ruggiero, who was then the executive director of the World Trade Organization. It drew much attention, and when you consider how we are dominated by the Washington consensus, right, the WTO and the IMF and World Bank, to come from the director of the WTO to say, actually, we need to counterbalance this at least. We need to have a World Environmental Organization to somehow rectify or redirect this sort of direction a little bit that might be of significance. And these proposals have been submitted by a number of countries in Europe, Germany and France in particular. And another aspect of the United Nations system is the Trusteeship Council, which used to operate in the 1960s and 1970s to help the transformation of former colonies to independent sovereign states. Ever since, there is a lot of support for the idea to advance the UN Trusteeship Council to an Environmental Trusteeship Council that would actually have the function to look after the global commons on behalf of humanity today and in the future. One prominent supporter of the Trusteeship Council idea is Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General. And yeah.
所以就是在这里的题目就是讲到就是一个信托的概念。那过去一段时间以来，就是其实有很多就是相关组织或外围组织都有谈到这样子的，就是都把这样子的概念纳入他们的提案中。那包括长久以来讨论要设置的世界环境组织或是全球环境组织这样子的一个概念。那最早在这个就是世界普遍性的那个就比较受关注的一个场合提出来这个观念的是当时的那个 WTO 这个执行长。那其实本来在这之前，就是大部分的公约啊，什么国际合作都还是在那种像华盛顿公约这一类就是主导性的一些概念底下运作。但是当时他就特别提出来说 ，WTO 未来在平衡各国的力量的时候，应该把像 WEO 就前面讲到这个世界环境组织或是全球环境组织这样子的。他们想要倡议的概念跟他们的想法放进来的时候，就受到很多的关注。那比较明确的是，像比如说德国政府，他们在跟过去的敌人巴西政府在讨论未来反而是要合作，更紧密的合作，然后更紧密的去解决环境问题的时候，就是类似这样的思潮之下去开始。那这也提出很多，再请大家就是仔细去看。
Our objective is to write a report with the proposal of establishing a United Nations working group or task force to investigate trusteeship governance of the global commons. The report will be presented to the Scientific Advisory Board for discussion and then recommendation to the Secretary General. It is important to note that there is currently no sufficient support among UN member states for such a far-reaching reform, or even for charging a UN-authorized working group with developing a proposal as envisaged here. But this may change as the dynamics of the global governance crisis continue to unfold. There is a general sense of urgency within global civil society and increased frustration with the failures of state-dominated international law and governance. This may well have spillover effects on UN organizations and at least on some UN member states known for their past support of trusteeship-type institutions, and likely to respond to this new initiative more favorably.
所以这样子的这一些委员会啊，就是我们刚刚略过了其中2段，那因为时间有限，所以直接回到就是在地球治理的这个计划，现在已经在撰写一些报告，那也不断的在推动，包括联合国的工作团队啊，或者任务小组一起来。 去处理跟参与这样子的事情。那但是很重要的一点是，就长期而言，我们还看不到目前国内目前国际上，包括像联合国主要会员的正面的支持或声明，那能够让我们知道这个倡议会在目前的现有架构底下得到任何程度的推动。所以其实就是国际上现在目前还不是能够很确定的知道会往哪个方向发展，但是目前全球的关系，包括一些就是恐怖分子的组织的这种，就是大家对于还有经济方面的问题，大家对于联合国或是对于各国能够处理就是国际议题的那种信任感已经一直在下降，所以包括联合国会员其中几个就是一直以来都持续就是对于这样子的国际治理保持高度怀疑的国家，很可能会投入像信托就是新的这种国际治理这种信托的这种概念。
Let me close with what I believe is the most pressing issue right now. We need to get into the habit of observing what people who govern us are actually doing. Politicians and decision makers need to be directly confronted with the ever-increasing gap between morality and public policy. We should look politicians over the shoulder, remind them of the ethical implications of what they are doing, and hold them accountable morally and where possible legally. Drawn from the experience of one of my colleagues, Don Brown, in the United States, who runs a global climate change ethics network and was a former negotiator for climate change of the Clinton administration, he has insider knowledge to offer. We need to understand that public policy has become so dominated by neoclassical economics that questions of ethics and morality are virtually always kept off the table. For the most part, this is done through two kinds of arguments. First, the goal of all policy is welfare maximization within given markets, in which all values are determined by the willingness to pay, measured in money. Second, no government involvement in free markets is ever justifiable unless there are high levels of scientific proof of some serious market failure with undeniable serious environmental impacts. This puts the stakes so high that only overwhelming fly-in-your-face evidence may result in some action. And even if there is overwhelming evidence, think of climate change, any action has to pass a utility test, usually in the form of cost-benefit analysis, instead of setting some non-negotiable ethical standards. Governments aim for some middle ground between markets and environmental needs.
所以到最后总结的这一部分呢，他想要谈的是一个，就是重要一个议题，就是解说。我们必须要建立起一个观察者的习惯，我们必须要持续不断，而且就是严厉的去监督我们目前的政策决策者、政治家，他们在面对道德跟公共政策的时候，实际上做了哪些事情，他们的概念是什么？我们必须要从他们的肩膀上面去提醒他们，去告诉他们说，他们所决定的政策背后的伦理意涵是不是符合大家公众的期待。那根据他一个非常重要的同事，唐布朗，他在美国就是在这方面的经验，他认为公共政策已经完全受到目前的新古典经济主义的影响。那所以这些就是关于伦理或环境的问题，一直被排除在讨论的那个桌子之外。那大部分来自两个部分，一个是所有的政策目标都以市场利益的最大化来讨论。那这部分的话，价值都是以就是金钱来衡量。那第二个是就是政府一向不是很想要直接的介入自由市场。所以他们希望可以就是处于中间地带，那既不就是让市场跟环境在它的两边，那不去讨论设定中间两边之间的那个伦理标准。 那比如说像在讨论那个环境全球暖化的议题的时候，这中间就很难去用就是各个政府的折损分析这样子的观念来去探讨，会出现这个问题。
But is there some middle ground really between market needs and environmental needs? A German poet named Friedrich von Logau said, in Gefahr und großer Not bringt der Mittelweg den Tod. In danger and great need, the middle ground spells death. Therefore, the first order is to recognize that environmental needs are fundamental. They are absolute, they are non-negotiable. This is, of course, the hidden ethical issues that is often overlooked by politicians, as mentioned. Environmental laws have, for the most part, completely lacked such a bottom line, such an absolute. They usually speak of the environment as a general concern, or they focus on individual environmental aspects, like water or biodiversity, without defining them to a degree that enables decision makers to draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable public action. Yet a clear definition is readily available. It is the integrity of ecological system as the core of sustainability. There are many ways to give legal expression and political weight to this Grundnorm. The best starting point remains the Earth Charter, which is of course crafted around the very notion of ecological integrity. And was written, the Earth Charter was written in the spirit of the Brundtland Report that set the whole international dialogue of sustainable development on its way. 1987. The Brundtland Report also emphasized the fundamental importance of ecological integrity. But of course states have not followed. That's why we have the Earth Charter, drafted by global civil society. The Earth Charter has been endorsed by a number of states and many thousands of organizations, local communities, universities, and so on. Yet the main challenge is still ahead of us. How to implement the Earth Charter's principles in constitutions, laws, and policies, and most importantly, in the heads and hearts of those in power. A free market ideology still dominates. Governments do not see the protection of our global natural and local commons as a priority. But ecological rationality trumps economic rationality. Markets can only ever operate in social and environmental spaces. They need investors, producers, workers, consumers, and natural resources, who all in turn depend on the availability of ecological systems. As we are overstepping planetary boundaries and damaging the integrity of the Earth's systems, markets would be foolish to keep ignoring them. Yet they are ecologically blind, and it is here where governments must step in. Give the market what the market needs, but stop market players from abusing the commons that belong to all of us. The key point of my talk this morning was that governments need our help. They are currently too weak to control the markets and protect us from economic imperialism. They will only gain or regain the necessary strength if we as the demos, the people, want them to, by reminding them of their core business, to govern for the common good and for the natural commons that we all need and depend on. Whether governments, including here in Taiwan, are willing and able to finally take charge, separate the market from the commons, and give priority to the commons will be the defining issue of our time.
简单结尾就是，其实，大致来说，这样子的生态的完整性啊，就是其实它应该是当我们谈到就是社会政策、国际政策的时候一个底线。 那当然，这样子的底线到目前为止，就是国际上当政府在说他们做不到的时候，他们都会说，因为他太不清楚了，我们不知道怎么去界定，所以他一直都被就是忽略而过这样子。但其实就是要再一次提出的是，其实很清楚的定义就是生态系统的完整性，这个已经在眼前了，只是大家不愿意去面对而已。那其中有许多的方法都可以去谈说这样子的一个概念已经开始产生它的影响力，包括当然它的起点是地球宪章。那地球宪章已经得到就是非常多世界公民还有世界公民团体的签署跟就是声明。那它是本着一个布兰特报告的精神去建构的。那这样的报告那个报告是非常就是生态流量非常重要的一个就是倡议，所以在包括联合国委员会里面有很多成员都强烈的提出，就是应该未来在谈论生态环境议题的时候，要以地球宪章来作为就是讨论的基础，但是仍然没有得到就是主流的声音，只有得到世界公民的那个参与，所以未来应该持续就是去就是本着地球宪章跟生态完整性的精神去讨论这个问题。那但是我们必须要面对的是，就是这个自由贸易市场的这种帝国主义，这个经济的这种帝国主殖民心态，是仍然还是深植在各国在政府在前进的时候的目前的一个基础。所以我们这个演讲的主旨其实是要强调说，目前的政府，每一个国家的政府都需要每个国家的国民的帮助，他们需要我们的帮助，因为他们现在都过于软弱，无法控制现有的市场，然后所以我们必须要去帮助政府去得到，或者说重新得到他们应该要站稳的角度。我们这些倡议者，我们要去提醒他们，政府的角色是一个管家的角色，他要管理好我们大家所需要而且依赖的那一些就是环境共有物。那所以包括台湾，我们必须要去就是告诉我们的政府说，这样子的东西是可以做得到的，而且是需要就是倾听人民的声音，然后去把它完成。因为一个市场不可能就是可以无限制的这样下去，它最终仍然需要它的生产者、它的消费者、它的投资者，所有的人一起仰赖这个市场的运作。所以市场持续的忽略自然环境的声音，其实是让这个市场最终会陷入。那所以这是我们这个时代的挑战，也是今天这个演讲要给大家的挑战。谢谢大家。
I was hoping to show you my favorite image, but it's not there. You just have to make the famous image. When you look at the Earth from a certain angle, all you ever see is water. With at the horizon Taiwan up there, and New Zealand at the bottom, North America there. So the Earth should really be called water. Perhaps you got even that wrong. Is it there? Yeah, it's not here. Yeah, that's up there. Oh yeah, you can bring it up now, yes. Good night. Oh, this was some inches. Let's see it. Oh, it's not even there. Okay. No, even there. No, it's not. No, this is an old picture. Yeah. No, you have to get rid of it. Never mind.
谢谢 Bosselmann 老师对我们的演讲，那也请大家再给他一次鼓励，谢谢。